We are not beginning anything new with this session. We are concluding what we started about 8 days ago in the beach office of Sri Aurobindo Society in Pondicherry. But before I take up what is left over from Canto 7, Book 7, I would like to say that it is very, very appropriate that we hold the concluding session here, because as you will see, this passage that I am going to present to you today, which is about 2 pages, describes a consciousness which Savitri attained towards the end of her yoga, which is described in the whole of Book 7. And this is Savitri's attaining the cosmic consciousness. And Savitri's attaining the cosmic consciousness was in many ways very unique. She had already attained the Gnostic consciousness, the supramental consciousness, and then when she attains the cosmic consciousness, she feels that the whole world exists within herself. And this is the reality, this is the truth. You and I, Auroville, Savitri Bhavan, the whole world, Germans and the French and the English and Indians and Pakistanis and the Americans and Russians, we all exist in the being of Savitri, and for us, Savitri was the mother, and she is doing this yoga. And Auroville itself primarily exists in her consciousness. It is growing in her consciousness, and we all belong there. And when you talk about mother's consciousness, the final central truth about that consciousness is unity, is union. And this is all a manifestation of the Supreme Divine. That's the kind of feeling Savitri has. And so I am concluding that particular canto which describes this. And what better place could we have assembled in but Savitri Bhavan on the soil of Auroville. And it's also significant that this marks the 10th year of our sacrifice, what is called the study of Savitri. We began in 1989, and this is 1999, and I guess our tapasya has been amply rewarded by the Supreme by bringing into being Savitri Bhavan and also this building, and many, many receptive minds and hearts in Auroville who are always anxious and eager to welcome us. In fact, what used to happen until now, that day I concluded my Savitri session in Pondicherry, I used to come here at the invitation of friends from Savitri Bhavan, and when this was announced in Pondicherry, busloads of people on their own would also come. So this is only happening formally now. This has been happening informally for several years now. So we thought, why don't you give it a formal kind of shape? And so we decided when I came here last year, in consultation with Sridhavan and Francis and so on, that we'll hold this time the concluding session here. And by the Mother's grace, everything has come right, including the weather. So this particular canto that I was reading, it's difficult to talk about 7 cantos in one brief session, but I will say what Savitri received as a commandment. What was Savitri's yoga about? And then we can see in the light of this commitment what Savitri has really achieved. And if you remember, this commandment was given to her in Canto 2, Book 7. I'll read that. This is the yoga of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother in a nutshell, as it was revealed to Savitri by a voice which came from the highest levels of her own being. The voice replied, those of you who have the text, it's on page 476. 476. The voice replied, remember why thou camest, find out thy soul, recover thy hid self, In silence seek God's meaning in thy depths. Yeah, if you have other earlier editions, could be 556. But since I can't look into other people's books, my book says 476. Okay. Then mortal nature changed to divine. Open God's door, enter into his trance, cast thought from thee, that nimble ape of light, in his tremendous hush, stilling thy brain, his vast truth wake within, and know and see, cast from thee sense that veils thy spirit's sight, in the enormous emptiness of thy mind, thou shalt see the Eternal's body in the world, know him in every voice heard by thy soul, in the world's contacts meet his single touch, all things shall fold thee into his embrace, conquer thy heart's throbs, let thy heart beat in God, thy nature shall be the engine of his works, thy voice shall house the mightiness of his word, then shalt thou harbor my force and conquer death. Now, from this point on, we have here descriptions of various kinds of yogas that Savitri pursued, one after the other. And during my discussion of this, I pointed out that Savitri's job it was to try out various yogas, to rid them of their excesses and prepare them, as it were, for the modern man. And so she follows the yogas of various kinds, and primarily the yoga of the psychic. That's what Savitri follows, and that's the yoga that she has given to mankind, and that is described in great length, if you remember, in Canto 5, which is the finding of the soul, where how Savitri finds the soul, and how in Canto 2, for example, we have been given a very clear description of the parts and planes of being. So one of the things in Savitri's yoga is a yogi must be aware of the various parts and planes of her being. And in Canto 3, we are given the yoga of the inner mind, the inner vital, the inner being, and how these inner centers have to be opened up so that they receive the light, the knowledge, and ananda from above. All this is beautifully described. Then you come to Canto 4, when Savitri meets the three Madonnas. And the three Madonnas are the Madonna of compassion, the Madonna of power, and the Madonna of light. And I try to point out that Savitri must have met these Madonnas in the level of the overmental. These are goddesses of the overmental. The problem with the overmental is these goddesses are triple, they are not triune. They do not combine all these light, compassion, and power together. Power goes one way, wisdom goes another way, and then compassion goes the third way. As a result, you will see that each one of these powers has become perverted in the earth consciousness. And Savitri sees the Madonnas and also their perversions and assures these Madonnas that she will one day come back and put all their strength together so that in a kind of triune power they will be able to bring succor, help, redemption for the whole of mankind. And she proceeds, and in Canto 5 we have a beautiful description of Savitri's soul or Savitri's psychic being meeting the Jivatman. In Savitri's case, the Jivatman is none other than the Adi Shakti, the Supreme Mother herself. And this has been described. And as a result, we have also been given the yoga of the Kundalini. You see, Sri Aurobindo has pointed out that in my yoga, I have brought together the Vedantic yogas and the Tantric yogas. And he has pointed out the Tantric yogas were necessary because the Tantra had the secret of transforming human nature. And that is why I had to use the Tantric techniques but I have not used them as they are found in the tantric textbooks. I have modified them to suit my purpose. There is also the raising of the Kundalini. Here the raising of the Kundalini is not a physical exercise. The raising of the Kundalini here is left to the sweet will of the Divine Mother. And she does it in her own way. You don't have to physically arouse Kundalini, provoke Kundalini either through pranayam or through other exercises. But there are ways of the Supreme Mother herself, Maha Kundalini itself, comes into your being and then raises the Kundalini, and the rising of the Kundalini, the blooming of all the lotuses, and the Kundalini from the Muladhara merging or meeting the Shakti power in the Sahasradala Padma in the head. All these things are important, necessary, and this is what Sri Aurobindo says I have used. So, although he doesn't use the old tantric techniques, the principles involved in it he has assimilated in his yoga, and we see this. And then at the end of Canto 5, Savitri has achieved the supramental consciousness, and she has also offered her Prakriti, the whole of her being, for transformation, and as an individual she is perfect. But then, as I have always been saying, the aim of Sri Aurobindo's yoga was never to prepare a perfect freak, somebody who has done marvels in his individual life. Sri Aurobindo always was asking this question, what can humanity get out of this? Now, Savitri has achieved this tremendous thing which is called the Gnostic consciousness. Does that ensure that other human beings automatically benefit from it? And the answer was no. And so, Savitri had the further responsibility. And the voice says to Savitri, please don't expose whatever you have won. Hide it within your heart and try to work for the establishment of a Gnostic community. Until a Gnostic community is established, the manifestation, the divine manifestation will not take place. And here you are born not for your personal triumph. One person rose so high that in spiritual history nobody had risen so high. That's not the glory that the Mother and Sri Aurobindo want. What they want is, as a result of their tapasya, humanity will be able to access this path. And how do we do it? And Savitri then tries what is described in Canto 6, a yoga of purification, of yoga of emptying herself, and she empties herself and becomes a pure conduit, a pure channel for the divine force to descend, and the divine force, the supraconscient force, descends on humanity through Savitri's being. So, as he said, Sri Aurobindo says in the Mother, you have the aspiration calling from below and the supreme grace from that answers from above, but in spite of these two, something else is needed, and that is the Mother's presence, the Mother's power. In what way that is necessary, all these things are described, and we have seen that, Canto 6, where you have the yoga of nirvana. And Sri Aurobindo emphasizes that the yoga of nirvana is necessary as a technique for certain purposes. Savitri goes through this, but Savitri's aim is not to lose herself, is not to merge herself in the supreme consciousness, but the yoga of nirvana has certain definite techniques of emptying a person. You see, one of the things that I have been talking about during the last 7-8 days is when you do tapasya in whatever field it is, whether in sports or in teaching or in doing anything, you get some siddhis. And the same thing is true in spiritual life. We all get siddhis, but we become so enamored of our own siddhis that we begin to hug them and don't want to give them up. And if you hug your siddhis, you become a frozen saint, and there is no more progress for you. So one of the things in this yoga is a constant growth, a constant giving up, a constant surrendering, a constant emptying. How much this process is necessary is what is emphasized in Savitri's yoga. And in Canto 7 that we are talking about, you are shown that Savitri has now opened herself to a Gnostic consciousness, a consciousness which is beyond what is called in the Gita the Kshara and the Akshara. The being and the non-being are all fused, and the From this level, she experiences the cosmic consciousness. And what does the cosmic consciousness look like? That was what we were reading on page 556. Middle of page 556. Her spirit saw the world as living God. It saw the One and knew that all was He. Now, cosmic consciousness can be achieved at various levels. You can achieve it at the vital level, at the mental level, at the levels above the mind, and depending on what level you achieve it, there are corresponding siddhis. Now, Savitri achieves it at the Gnostic level, at the supramental level. And here, as you will see, as a result of this, her spirit saw the world as living God. You see, the cosmic consciousness, as I was pointing out this morning, is needed because when you withdraw your consciousness from the surface reality of this world, what is called the world of the kshara, the world of becoming, which changes every minute, which is never the same, and withdraw yourself, you come to another level of consciousness which is described as the consciousness of the eternal, the consciousness of the akshara. Now, this consciousness of the akshara is wonderful, except that if you take your poise here for too long, far too long, you lose the contact with the real world. Now, how do you maintain this detachment from the real world, the inward detachment from the real world, your poise of consciousness in the one, and yet be able to deal with the many? How do you do it? And the way for it in the traditional yogas has been to try for the cosmic consciousness. That is, your consciousness is made so wide, so universal, that there is no possibility of your once again becoming egotistic, becoming narrow, even when you deal with the world. You are dealing with the world, but not in the old consciousness, but in a wider consciousness, where the whole world, you are looking at the whole world as one manifestation of the Supreme Divine, and you are one of the faces of the Divine. You are one of the centers of the Divine. This is the old traditional way, the reason for trying to achieve cosmic consciousness. In Savitri's case, that has now come in a very stupendous way, and she finds her spirit saw the world as living God. It saw the One and knew that all was He. Now, this was not a mental formulation for Savitri. This was a direct experience, that the whole world for her now was the Supreme Divine. There is no imperfection in this world. There are no scars in this world. Everything is He. Everything is throbbing with God's presence. She knew Him as the absolute self-space. Now, there come lines, passages, where the only comment, as I sometimes say, is maunam. You just read the passages, read a second time, and listen to the words, and let the words sink within your consciousness and open the meaning to you. We don't want any other commentary than that. And now here we come across a passage of that nature. She knew Him as the absolute self-space, one with herself and ground of all things here, in which the world wanders seeking for the truth. Guarded behind its face of ignorance, she followed Him through the march of endless time. All nature's happenings were events in her. If bombs are dropped somewhere in Europe, somebody who has the cosmic consciousness will feel that they are being dropped within him. That's the kind of identification with the whole world, cosmic consciousness. And so she felt all nature's happenings were events in her. The heartbeats of the cosmos were her own. All beings thought and felt and moved in her. Everybody lived in her, in her own being. She inhabited the vastness of the world. Its distances were her nature's boundaries. Its closeness, her own life's intimacies. Her mind became familiar with its mind. Its body was her body's larger frame. See, Savitri felt the whole world is an extension of her body. It's not as if her body is, the usual human body and then there is the world. The entire physical world, she began to feel, was an extension of her own body. Its body was her body's larger frame, in which she lived and knew herself in it, one, multitudinous in its multitudes. She was one in the multitude, and yet everybody in the multitude was she. This is a kind of feeling difficult to capture in words, describe in words. English language was not made for this kind of an experience, to describe this kind of an experience. Sri Aurobindo is pulling it by its tail, as it were, and trying to enrich its resources by trying to use it for descriptions of this kind. She was a single being, yet all things. She was a single being, yet she was all beings. The world was her spirit's wide circumference. The thoughts of others were her intimates. Any thought arose in anyone else, they were also intimate to herself. Their feelings close to her universal heart. Their bodies, her many bodies kin to her. There have been experiences when the mother was in her body in the ashram, when certain things happened anywhere in the ashram, the eruptions would be on the mother's body. She didn't have to be told that such and such a person had done such and such a thing automatically. And it is this that would tell her that something that should not have happened is happening. So this is not make-believe, this is not fiction. This is the triumph of consciousness. The cosmic consciousness, if you have it, it has such a great power. Their feelings close to her universal heart, their bodies, her many bodies kin to her. She was no more herself, but all the world. She was not one individual, she was the whole world itself. Out of the infinitudes all came to her. Into the infinitude sentient she spread. Infinity was her own natural home. Nowhere she dwelt, her spirit was everywhere. The distant constellations wheeled around her. She felt all the stars, the planets, the entire movement of the universe was taking place with her in the center. The distant constellations wheeled around her. Earth saw her born. All worlds were her colonies. Her colonies were not restricted to the earth alone, but all the mental worlds, the vital worlds, all the subtle worlds, she felt, were all the colonies of her own being. The greater worlds of life and mind were hers. All nature reproduced her in its lines. Its movements were large copies of her own. She was the single self of all these selves. She was in them, and they were all in her. This first was an immense identity, in which her own identity was lost. What seemed herself was an image of the whole. Then comes a beautiful passage where she was a subconscient life of tree and flower. When a tree blossomed, a rose blossomed on a bush, Savitri felt that the rose blossomed within her own being, within her own consciousness. And the sap of the tree which was rising in the trunk of the tree, she identified herself with it and felt that sap was rising in her, within her. Her identification, therefore, was not just with the human world, her identification with the entire sentient world, trees, birds, animals, everywhere. She was a subconscient life of tree and flower, the outbreak of the honeyed buds of spring. She burned in the passion and splendor of the rose. If the rose had any splendor, the rose had any passion, she felt the rose was expressing, manifesting her inner splendor, her inner passion. She was the red heart of the passion flower, the dream white of the lotus in its pool. Now, these are not very distant things. If you read prayers and meditations, there is a particular prayer I would like to read out to you to show how close this experience is with the experience that the mother once described. This is Prayers and Meditations on April the 7th, 1917. It's a very well-known, in some circles, prayer. This is how it reads. Listen to it carefully. See, this is a prayer. Compare this experience described in the prayer with these lines. She was a subconscient life of tree and flower, the outbreak of the honeyed buds of spring. She burned in the passion and splendor of the rose. She was the red heart of the passion flower, the dream white of the lotus in its pool. She says in this prayer, a deep concentration seized on me, and I perceived that I was identifying myself with a single cherry blossom. You know what cherry blossom is? A single cherry blossom, then through it with all cherry blossoms. And as I descended deeper in the consciousness, following a stream of bluish force, I became suddenly the cherry tree itself. She said, I first identified myself with one single flower, cherry flower blossom, then with all the cherry blossoms. And as my concentration got deeper, I felt I had become the cherry tree itself. And as I descended deeper in the consciousness, following a stream of bluish flower, I became suddenly the cherry tree itself, stretching towards the sky like so many arms, its innumerable branches laden with their sacrifice of flowers. That she was herself standing as the cherry blossom tree, offering all her riches to the divine in a kind of sacrificial offering. Then I heard distinctly this sentence, thus hast thou made thyself one with the soul of the cherry trees, and so thou canst take note that it is the divine who makes the offering of this flower prayer to heaven. When I had written it, all was effaced, but now the blood of the cherry tree flows in my veins. See, the blood that flows in my veins and the sap that goes up the cherry blossom tree, they're all the same. It's the same material. But now the blood of the cherry tree flows in my veins, and with it flows an incomparable peace and force. What difference is there between the human body and the body of a tree? What difference is there between the human body and the body of a tree? In truth, there is none. The consciousness which animates them is identically the same. Then the cherry tree whispered in my ear. What did the cherry tree say? It is in the cherry blossom that lies the remedy for the disorders of the spring. It is the cherry blossom that lies the remedy for the disorders of the spring. It's for nothing. When Sri Aurobindo was writing Savitri, very often the next morning he would come to the mother and read out some of the passages that he had written the previous night. And you know what the mother used to say? She used to protest, "O Lord, you have laid open all my secrets." All the secrets of our own sadhana, of our own yoga were all here. Now, it is very tempting to, as I said in my talks there also, to extrapolate from here the mother's life, sadhana, based on other material now available and build various kinds of theories. But I desist from them. This is not a healthy occupation. Savitri, after all, is poetry. And Sri Aurobindo, up to a limit, the truth of Savitri, the truth of the mother who lived with her. But trying to apply every line from here to the life of the mother or vice versa is not, I don't think, is a very wise occupation. Savitri has its place. As I said, Savitri, the truth of Savitri, the truth of the Divine Mother. But still, this is a work of art, there is a fiction. Sri Aurobindo had a certain framework which he had to use. He couldn't take liberties with the story and so on. And therefore, if events from mother's life shed more light and enable you to understand passages from Savitri, that's the thing that's worth doing, and not try to go back and say, oh, this is what they said in Savitri, so this must have happened to the mother. That, I think, is a very risky kind of game, because none of us is really a yogi of that height that we can say exactly this is where the mother was, this is what the mother was, I know this. And so, prayers and meditation, of course, is a very, very good companion. There are many, many passages in the prayers and meditations which also talk about the kinds of things that Savitri here goes through. Okay, so let us continue, and my determination is to conclude well before 4, so that those of you who want to go to Auroville for a darshan, for a visit, will be able to stand in the queue by 4:30 and won't feel disappointed. Okay. She was a subconscient life of tree and flower, the outbreak of the honeyed buds of spring. She burned in the passion and splendor of the rose. She was the red heart of the passion flower, the dream white of the lotus in its pool. Out of subconscient life she climbed to mind. She was thought and passion of the world's heart. She was the Godhead hid in the heart of man. She was the climbing of his soul to God. If the evolution starts from dead matter and then manifests life, then manifests more and more complex forms of life, and then we come to mind, and from mind it is rising beyond the mind, and Savitri now felt it is she who is rising along the evolutionary route. Out of subconscient life she climbed to mind. She was thought and the passion of the world's heart. She was the Godhead hid in the heart of man. She was the climbing of his soul to God. The cosmos flowered in her. She was its bed. The entire cosmos flowered in her being. She was time and the dreams of God in time. She was time and also the dreams of God in time. Time is the field for manifestation. When you talk about the manifestation, then you think of time and space. And manifestation and the becoming becomes possible because of the mother. She makes the becoming possible. And therefore he says she was time and the dreams of God in time. She was space and the wideness of his days. From this she rose where time and space were not. She goes beyond this to a point where there is no time and no space. The superconscient was her native air. Infinity was her movement's natural space. Eternity looked out from her on time. Now here we conclude our reading, our study of Canto 7, Book 7. It has been a very exciting journey for us following Savitri's yogic path. And as I pointed out in one of her prayers, she says, "O Lord, you are asking me to try out various paths of yoga. so that ultimately I may be able to bring them together and offer a kind of a synthetic integral yoga. These are my words, they are not her words. The words were different. And this is what she has tried, and we have seen various kinds of things that Savitri tries. Now, as I said, I just don't want to go on and on. You have been listening to me for the last 8 days, 2.5 hours or 2 hours every morning. However charming a man's voice is, 20 hours is too long, and I think therefore I will conclude. But before I conclude, I would like to read a prayer which is one of the favorite of many people here, and then conclude. And I would like to say that those of us who have been participating in this Savitri study, we have been going on doing this for the last 8 years, feel very grateful for the privilege given to us to come here and hold our concluding session. This Savitri is that spirit which unites, and so whether you belong to the ashram or anywhere else, or you belong to here, that country, this country, as I said in the beginning, we all live in the mother's consciousness. And if we live in the mother's consciousness, there is in fact no reason for us to feel any difference. If you feel any difference, you are yourself driving yourself out of the mother's consciousness. So unity is what the name of this game, and we are all united in the mother's consciousness, and Savitri is the presiding spirit of this consciousness. And we feel happy, and thank you very much, Shuddhavan, for taking all the trouble, arranging all the buses, and whoever is responsible for the prasad that's going to come. Thank you very much. And as I said in the morning, the Auroville Darshan line closes at 4:30. So as soon as I conclude, those of you who want to go to Auroville for a visit, not for meditation, but for a visit, please get into your buses. The bus will take you to Auroville, and after the darshan is over, it will come back and the prasad will be waiting for you. Okay. Now I will conclude with this last prayer. O thou whom at first sight I knew for the Lord of my being and my God, receive my offering. Thine are all my thoughts, all my emotions, all the sentiments of my heart, all my sensations, all the movements of my life, each cell of my body, each drop of my blood. I am absolutely and altogether thine, thine without reserve. What thou wilt of me, that I shall be. Whether thou choosest for me life or death, happiness or sorrow, pleasure or suffering, all that comes to me from thee will be welcome. Each one of thy gifts will be always for me a gift divine, bringing with it the supreme felicity.